Mr. President, we don't have the luxury of time here. I think we all know that. Certainly the American people know it. They can see it sort of just unfolding right in front of them. We've got small businesses that are shutting down, which of course affects the people who work there. We've got healthcare systems that have tremendous needs, and obviously they're on the front lines of fighting the coronavirus. We continue to try and make progress on a piece of legislation that really should have been proceeded to today. The vote we had earlier today was a procedural vote. It was basically, are we going to get on the bill? And what you saw was the Democrats object to even getting on the bill. Now, obviously, as the leader pointed out, once you're on the bill, you have 30 hours, if you choose to use it, in which to continue to discuss and debate. If there are things that they are continuing to work on, certainly they could have that opportunity to do that. But the vote today, which you saw the Democrats oppose, was simply whether or not we are going to get on the bill. A bill that is desperately needed by our country right now, and I would argue that the American people are looking to us for action. And frankly, as I said, we just don't have the luxury of time. And the Democratic leader got up earlier and said that this is a partisan bill, and that's just false. That's just flatly untrue, Mr. President. This has been negotiated for the past few days now between Democrats and Republicans. Leader McConnell appointed several task forces, and the Democratic leader appointed representatives from his side to serve on those task forces. They've been negotiating elements of this bill now for the past few days. And frankly, what you see, the legislation in front of us, reflects that work. And there is a tremendous amount of bipartisan content in this bill. The Democrats had ample opportunities to make their case and to try and get things included that they said they wanted. And just to sort of highlight again what the Democrats said their priorities were in this legislation, phase 3, if you will, it was about workers, it was about small businesses, it was about unemployment insurance, they called it unemployment insurance on steroids, it was about hospitals, and I have to say that I see in this piece of legislation all of that. What they just voted to even debate includes all of those elements. In fact, if you look at what this bill includes, if you're talking about providing help to families and people who really need it in this country, immediately, $1,200 checks to individual taxpayers, $2,400 to a couple who file jointly, and that runs through income levels all the way up. If you're a single taxpayer, $75,000, phases out at about $99,000. For couples filing jointly, $150,000, phases out after that. And then $500 for each child in this country. And that was something that was a priority for both sides. The Democrats wanted to have that in this legislation, and there were many Republicans who did as well. The President is something that he supported. And so that was a bipartisan priority that ended up in this legislation. It will bring immediate relief, get dollars back in the hands of American families to enable them to deal with their daily needs and as best they can with the crisis that we have unfolding in front of us. And then you had, of course, a huge priority for the Democrats, which was the so-called UI on steroids, the unemployment insurance program. And I have to say, my colleague from Ohio, Senator Portman, did a terrific job of laying out all the elements of this legislation. But as he mentioned, unemployment insurance was a big priority for the Democrats. Well, there is a big commitment to plussing up, topping off the unemployment accounts that the states maintain, $600 per week for 3 months into those unemployment accounts. So if you're unemployed in this country and you go down to the unemployment office in your state, what you would normally receive in terms of a benefit would be increased by $600 per week, per person, for 3 months. That was a huge priority for the Democrats, and one that Republicans as well believed was important. So we have not only the checks going out immediately that will benefit families, but we also have now an unemployment insurance program delivered through the states that will provide assistance to those who have lost jobs. And then, of course, we had another priority the Democrats mentioned was they wanted to provide assistance, much-needed assistance, to small businesses. And if you look at what's in this bill for small businesses, there is basically a loan program operated under the Small Business Administration in which participating lenders, and that could include commercial banks, community banks, credit unions, as we mentioned earlier, where small businesses could go to get loans, 100% guaranteed, which if used to pay payroll, if used to keep their employees employed over this period, would be forgiven at the end. To the total tune of about $350 billion total as part of this package. That's what it adds up to. But that, again, is a benefit that would go out for the next 8 weeks to small businesses, and if used to keep their employees employed, in other words, keep them connected to their jobs in hopes that when this thing passes, that those jobs will still be there. So $350 billion there, $300 billion for checks that would go out to families, as I said earlier, and $250 billion to plus up the unemployment insurance accounts that the states maintain. Those are all benefits that will go out to workers in this country, to employees, to keep people afloat, if you will, until we get to a better time, hopefully not too far ahead of us. And so those were all priorities that both sides had. And that's just what Democrats voted against. When we had the vote earlier about whether even to get on the bill, whether to debate the bill, they voted no. They voted no in bloc. And as you saw shortly after that, significant drop in the futures market. And I think that the markets, in addition to the American people, are looking to us to provide confidence, to provide a shot in the arm to suggest that we get what's at stake and how important it is that we respond not only swiftly, but in a bold and big way. And so those are just a few of the things that were included in there that are Democrat priorities and represent the work of a bipartisan task force. Now, the Democrats have argued that perhaps there's too much in here that are in the form of bailouts. Well, there is a provision in here through the Federal Reserve that would allow loans to be made to companies who need cash flow, who need liquidity, and obviously those are loans that would be paid back. So I don't know how you can argue something is a bailout when people are getting loans, businesses are getting loans that ultimately have to be paid back. But that's a provision in the bill. But if you don't have that in there, a lot of those businesses that through no fault of their own have been shuttered or asked to shut down, and use some good examples, notable examples, the airlines, basically are not operating. 10%, maybe 20%, but more likely, from what I'm hearing, 10% of their normal loads. I mean, they are going to have huge hits to their balance sheets. And other companies like those across this country right now who are feeling a tremendous amount of economic harm. And the reason that's important, Mr. President, is because those people, those companies, those businesses employ thousands, millions of workers across this country. And if we want to keep people employed in this country, we have to keep those businesses functioning and operating in a way that will enable them to continue to make payroll. And so, yes, there's a provision in there that helps businesses sort of get liquidity, loan, if you will, capital, if you will, that will bridge to hopefully a better time. But those loans eventually, obviously, would be paid back. And so the Democrats were very insistent there not be any corporate bailouts, not any bailouts for big businesses. And I don't know how you can argue that what this includes is a bailout for big businesses. There's simply a mechanism, a credit facility, as it's referred to, that would enable businesses to have access to loans that they could use to keep their businesses up and operating. And so those are just a few of the features in the legislation that was just voted down, or even whether or not to debate it or not, was voted down by the Democrats. And I want to mention one last thing here, Mr. President, that the Democrats also voted against, even debating when they came out here and all voted against this, is a significant amount of money going to those entities that we know are on the front lines of fighting this virus. And we've all said that the best way to get the economy back on track, the best way to see things restored to normal in this country, is to defeat the virus. Well, there are significant resources in this legislation that are designed just to do that. $75 billion going to hospitals, and another $20 or $25 billion that will go to hospitals through other programs, mandatory part of the spending. This comes through the appropriations bill, so these are discretionary funds. So about $100 billion in there for hospitals. $20 billion for veterans health care. Of course, veterans hospitals and healthcare facilities are really critical to caring for a critical group of people in this country, those who have defended and fought for our freedoms. $11 billion for vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other preparedness needs. In other words, all those things that we hear talked about, in addition to gloves and masks and ventilators, those sorts of things, but also the money going into vaccines. Ultimately, the way we're going to beat this is we've got to have a vaccine, Mr. President. So $11 billion in there for that. $4.5 billion for the Centers for Disease Control, which was also plussed up in terms significantly in the last two bills that we passed. The one most recently, earlier this week, had significant additional resources in there for the CDC. $1.7 billion for the Strategic National Stockpile. $12 billion for America's military, which I think we all agree is a priority for everyone here. National security is always an issue that we pay a lot of attention to, particularly in time of crisis. $10 billion for block grants to states, just directly block grants to states. $12 billion for K-12 education. Another $6 billion for higher education. $5 billion for FEMA, Disaster Relief Fund. $10 billion for airports, and obviously airports are very much impacted by this complete drop-off when it comes to air traffic in this country. $20 billion for public transportation emergency relief. That adds up to, Mr. President, $242 billion on top of all the things that I just mentioned, going to things that we think are really strategic when it comes to defeating this virus and combating it, and making sure that those resources are available to those who are on the front lines in doing that. So all told, of that $242 billion, 75%, or $186 billion, goes through the states. And the Democrats have said, we need more money for the states. We need more money for the states. Well, this is a pretty, I would think, significant amount, $186 billion out of the $242 billion that I just described runs through the states. And so there is a tremendous amount of support for those who are on the front lines trying to fight and defeat this coronavirus, Mr. President. So I just point all that out to say again that it is a complete misnomer to say, as the Democratic leader did earlier, that this was a partisan bill. This is a bipartisan bill. And I participated in one of those working groups, and I sat across from my Democrat counterpart, or at times more than one, and with staffs, and we came to the table with a set of priorities. They came to the table with a set of priorities, and what this represents is not everything they wanted, probably not everything we wanted, but the things that we could find that we could agree upon. And so this was a very bipartisan process which incorporated the ideas of both Republicans and Democrats. It is truly unfortunate, frankly sad day, I would argue, here in the United States Senate and for our country, that the Democrats opted just a moment ago to vote not even to get on this bill, not even to proceed to it, to give us the opportunity to have that, continue that discussion, that debate. They indicated that there's still discussions going on. I hope that's the case, because I've said this before, we don't have the luxury of time, Mr. President. We need action. We need action now, not later, now. The American people need to see relief. They need to see confidence in their elected leaders and a willingness to work in a bipartisan way on a solution, perhaps many solutions, hopefully included in this legislation, to the challenges that they're facing in their everyday lives. And so I'd say it's unfortunate we're not going to be on this bill right now. I hope and pray for the sake of our country and for the people who are not only suffering from the coronavirus, those who have loved ones and those who are exposed to it, those who are caring for them, but also for every worker, every small business in this country, that the Democrats will reconsider and allow us to get on this legislation and move forward in a bipartisan way on a bipartisan bill, which they helped fashion, which they helped craft, that is critical to the challenges that we are facing in the days and the weeks ahead. Mr. President, I yield the floor.